Welcome to the final session of the Animal Law Symposium. My name is Kim Kelly, and I'm the Legislative Affairs Program Director at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. As mentioned, this session features a pre-recorded conversation where I'll be joined by David Rosengard and Vanessa Shakib. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce David and Vanessa. As a senior staff attorney in the Animal Legal Defense Fund's Criminal Justice Program, David works with stakeholders across the criminal justice system to pursue justice on behalf of animal cruelty victims. Additionally, David teaches animal law at his alma mater, Lewis and Clark Law School, where he graduated twice with honors as both a JD and an animal law LLM student. Prior to embarking on his legal career, David earned a BA with honors in History and Gender Studies from Claremont McKenna College and worked in higher education. Vanessa Shakib is the co-founder and co-director of Advancing Law for Animals, a nonprofit law firm for our non-human friends. There, she develops impact litigation to further the interests of animals exploited in research and industrial food production. Prior to animal law, Vanessa specialized in illegal taxation, consumer protection, and inverse condemnation, among other practice areas. Her track record and government oversight informs her work at Advancing Law for Animals, where she has successfully challenged cruel and illegally promulgated regulations at the federal level and lack of animal welfare enforcement at the local level. For decades, the United States has relied on an industrialized animal agriculture model where family farms have increasingly been bought and transitioned to factory farms that are mostly controlled by a handful of behemoth corporations. Our current laws support this model and are poorly calibrated to address the risk of zoonotic disease spreading from animal to animal and animal to human and factory farms, which gives rise to conditions ripe for another pandemic. During yesterday's zoonotic disease and factory farming session, our speakers discussed the conditions in factory farms and slaughterhouses, as well as government subsidies that incentivize bad behavior. Could you talk about some of the additional legal shortcomings and agricultural practices that could lead to the next pandemic?
Kim, that's a great question. The Centers for Disease Control is calling antibiotic resistance one of the biggest public health challenges of our time. One aspect of this global crisis is resistance developing in zoonotic bacteria. So you might be wondering, how is that happening? Well, this is in response to our use and our overuse of antibiotics in animals confined for industrial food production. Now, it's really important to flag that there's an overlap between antibiotics used to treat infections in animals as well as antibiotics used to treat infections in humans. So now the question is, how are these resistant bacteria transferring from animals to humans, and what does that mean for our health? So if we take a step back, animals are very similar to us. Their intestines hold bacteria the way that ours does. And so their intestines can also hold antibiotic resistant bacteria. Now, we've spent this conference learning about how these animals are intensely confined and they can transmit bacteria among one another. But when they're slaughtered and ultimately when their bodies are processed, packaged, and transported, these present an event of transmission possibilities. Now, at the same time, animal feces and other waste can also be contaminated with antibiotic resistant bacteria. So if there is water that's been exposed to animal waste that's then used to irrigate fruits, veggies, or produce, then those crops can also be contaminated. So that means that we as humans, as well as our companion animals, are exposed when we come into direct contact with contaminated foods and also when we handle these contaminated foods. At the same time, we are also exposed through indirect contact with water that's been contaminated, whether that's through drinking or through swimming. And so I want to be clear, though, that this isn't a future problem. It's already a problem today. Every year in the United States, there's about 2.8 million people suffering from antibiotic-resistant infections, and of those, about 35,000 people are dying annually. And one note that I'd like to add is that these aren't localized problems. These are problems that spread. So a recent example of salmonella is quite telling. So that was a multi-state, multi-drug resistant salmonella strain that was found in raw chicken used for human consumption. It was found in raw chicken used for companion animal consumption, and it was also found in live chickens. So as you can see, this is a big problem with a lot of moving parts that advocates need to track.
Thanks, Vanessa. David, do you have more to add to that?
Certainly. So as Vanessa was saying, these issues that implicate a zoonotic outbreak risk vis-a-vis farmed animals are not future issues. These are issues that are happening right now. And there's an entire set of those that goes along with the conditions those animals live in and the experience those animals have to suffer. We've heard earlier in the conference about how intensive confinement of animals in factory farms increases the likelihood of animal-to-animal disease transition and also animal-to-human disease transition. There's some structural problems that make it harder to grapple with these issues. Specifically, I'm talking about the sort of mythological notion that cruelty law can't reach animals on factory farms, or that there's just no cruelty there. So there's at least 3 myths about farmed animals that I'd like to take the opportunity to dispel, because I think that will help us have a better idea of where our current system fails in terms of zoonotic risk and how we can try to address that. One is the notion that it would be new, it would be revolutionary to apply cruelty law to farmed animals. That's simply not the case. We can look at certainly the bulk of English and American common law, as well as statutory and case law, and find a number of examples of cruelty law being used for pigs, cows, horses, and so forth. There's this notion that kind of cruelty doesn't happen to farmed animals, that farmed animals somehow, by being farmed animals, by being on farms, aren't exposed to cruelty. And we know that's not the case. We know they experience conditions and treatment that are unpalatable, that are painful, that cause suffering. There is a question about whether that is lawful or unlawful cruelty, and I'll get to that in a moment, but there's nothing about being a farmed animal that means you can't be subject to cruelty. And finally, there's, as I've alluded to earlier, this notion that animal cruelty law doesn't reach farmed animals, that it can't intervene on their behalf. I want to be real with everyone. It's hard to intervene for farmed animals using cruelty law. There are legitimate challenges and hurdles to be overcome, but that doesn't mean you can't use cruelty law on behalf of farmed animals. And so I really see part of the story of our continuing and, as Vanessa said, current exposure to zoonotic disease risk as being a story of we as a nation, both on a federal and a state level, ineffectively applying existing cruelty law to farmed animals. There's more we could be doing to make conditions for animals healthier and therefore keep ourselves healthier if we really worked on applying cruelty law and punching through those myths.
During an earlier session, economist Galena Hale spoke to the issue of subsidies propping up the industry that makes factory farm meat cheaper at the expense of animal welfare, public health, and the environment. A popular way for consumer advocates to effectively use their purchasing power as a catalyst for change is to purchase plant-based alternatives. What other ways can consumer advocates effectively use their purchasing power?
Well, Kim, you really hit it that purchasing power is an important tool, although different individuals and families have access to different levels of purchasing power. So if you have relatively comfortable purchasing power and you have relative amounts of time available to you, you can definitely have a lot of fun exploring the grocery store, which has countless alternatives and substitutes to animal-based meats, eggs, and dairy products. And increasingly, meal delivery services for those pressed for time are either exclusively plant-based or offering those plant-based options. If you're limited in your purchasing power, there are other ways you can also pivot to increase the plants on your plate. First and foremost, purchasing in bulk is a cost-effective way to access staples like grains, like legumes, which include beans. And what's really amazing is if you band together with either your neighbor, your family, or a friend, you can buy in even greater bulk at discount stores. I think here we get into the issue of time though, because when you're buying these staples, especially in bulk, we get into issues of the time that it takes to prepare these healthy meals. And so there's a couple different suggested approaches here. Of course, you can take one day or evening of the week to prep for the rest of the week. You can also prep in bulk and freeze those meals. Another useful tool is, again, banding together with your family or your friends and your neighbor and sharing in that meal prep, and as well as sharing in cooking. And I also want to flag, when we're talking about access to fruits and veggies, that individuals either utilizing or eligible for the SNAP program, that's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, can use those benefits for fruits, veggies, and whole grains. Also, increasingly, more and more farmers markets are accepting SNAP benefits, and those benefits can also be used towards plants that grow food, as well as seeds to grow plants that grow food, which really taps into a trend that we're seeing more and more of urban gardening, community gardening, as well as guerrilla gardening. This looks a bit different in each case, but overall it's using that countertop space, it's using your windowsill, it's using any rooftop access you have, or any green space in the sidewalk or any other open public space to plant those fruits and veggies to share with yourself, your community. And the final note is really that sharing is really important. It's sharing those skills of how to cook and prepare plant foods. It's also sharing a passion for those foods. I can tell you that everyone around me is eating more veggies now that I'm always talking about them. And so I think if we work together, there are creative ways to get at expanding the plants on our plate.
Those are some really great ideas, Vanessa. And David, are there some ways we can hold legislators accountable for food accessibility, especially as pertains to plant-based diets?
Yes, and I really dug that answer, Vanessa, because I'm a sucker for the invisible hand doing things and the invisible hand being able to solve problems. The rub, of course, is the invisible hand, the metaphorical power of the market can only do that effectively when it isn't being manipulated. And right now, there's a lot of manipulation going on with the invisible hand. So I think part of the answer, and I think this is something you allude to, Kim, is helping people make equitable, fair choices about plant-based food, undistorting those economic decisions. So I'll give you a few examples. And I think one of them has already come up, and that's the degree to which the government either directly or indirectly purchases food products. The SNAP program that Vanessa mentioned is a great example of this, and that's a great example of it being done well. That's a scenario where that government purchasing power can be deployed to let people and help people purchase plant-based foods. But there are other scenarios where this could happen, and other scenarios where elected officials can take steps to encourage government purchasing power on behalf of plant-based foods. So, for example, any institution that involves government purchasing ought to, I would argue, be looking seriously at plant-based options. There's also a factor in terms of the way the government effectively shifts resources and power towards the non-plant-based diet right now, non-plant-based companies, animal agriculture, by propping up some of their food options through subsidies. I know we've talked about this in other sessions during this conference. And so one avenue that people can take is to pressure their lawmakers to pare those subsidies down or to impose equal subsidies on behalf of plant-based food. Which one you choose, I leave to you to make in terms of your own political feelings about subsidies. But suffice it to say, whether you love a subsidy or hate a subsidy, having unequal subsidies doesn't seem like a good way to encourage rational economic choice, much less to encourage the kind of healthy food options we're talking about here.
Thanks, David. So it sounds like in recent decades, we've certainly shifted the wrong way with animal agricultural production, but we're also swinging back the other way at this point with the development of more plant-friendly options as well. So there's hope on the horizon. So shifting gears, let's talk about wildlife for a couple of minutes. Many people are understandably fascinated by wildlife and are drawn to close encounter opportunities with a false sense of security regarding animal welfare, human health and safety, all based on lax laws and under-enforcement. During today's Zoonotic Disease and Captive Wildlife session, our speakers discussed key issues regarding captive wildlife used in entertainment. What are some other key issues regarding wildlife in captivity, especially as relates to the risk of zoonotic disease spread from animal to animal and animal to human?
Kim, well, if we look at the landscape nationally as well as globally, we're seeing wild animals in captivity used in a variety of contexts. We're seeing them in direct food consumption. We're seeing them in fiber and so-called fashion. We're seeing them in exhibition and purported entertainment. And we're also seeing them in experimentation. And so we need to examine all of these different contexts separately to understand their implications. And I know David and I have chatted a lot about live markets, and he has some really interesting expertise here.
Yeah, so I think it's important to break down a lot of the rhetoric around live markets, because this is a phrase that we've heard a lot since the pandemic began. But it's a phrase that also we don't often use to mean the same things. And I think it's important when we're talking to each other, especially when we're trying to come up with solutions and path forward, that we actually all are on the same page. So what is a live market? At its most basic, a live market is a venue where living animals, animals that are still alive, are sold direct to consumers for home slaughter or are slaughtered on site and sold directly to consumers. Now, we think a lot of times in popular culture, in discourse that's going on in social media, in some news coverage, there's a tendency in the United States to think of live markets as happening non-domestically. I am here to tell you that is not true. There are plenty of live markets in the United States of a wide variety of ranges. Anywhere you've been that has a lobster tank is a live market, unless those lobsters are being kept and cherished as companion friends. But odds are, if those lobsters are being sold as food, that is a live market. Those lobsters are alive. They're going to be dead when you eat them. Live market. Similarly, there are markets throughout the United States that sell live poultry, live fish, live crustaceans other than lobsters. There are certainly some venues that sell larger farmed mammals in a live market context. And this is problematic for a few reasons. One, and this I think Vanessa alludes to the overarching message of what you just said, which is that anytime you're putting a bunch of animals and a bunch of people in close proximity, you've got a zoonotic disease risk. That's particularly so in the context of live markets, where those animals are being either slaughtered on site or sold to consumers for home slaughter in a way that probably isn't going to be following the biosecurity standards that you might encounter in a more professionalized slaughter environment. Any kind of slaughter brings a disease risk. Any kind, because you're exposing yourself to animal bodily fluids, viscera. Moreover, when you've got a lot of animals and people, again, crammed into a space, exposed to each other's bodily fluids, you've got a great recipe for zoonotic disease crossover. The kind of recipe that puts diseases in an ideal position to jump from one species to the next. And that's when you get a zoonotic outbreak.
That's really interesting, David. And it's interesting to deal with this misconception that we don't have live markets here in the United States. I think additionally, there's some misconceptions also around experimentation. Experimentation is interesting because we don't often associate it with wild animals. But the truth is, we're not just breeding animals for use in labs. we're catching animals for use in labs. Although the total number of wild animals being used to pinpoint is difficult to calculate. Now, if you're interested in this space, check out White Coat Waste, which has recently blown the whistle on US taxpayer money used to subsidize dangerous experimentation with wild caught animals. And this is something that we really need to shine a light on because of the history both in the US and around the world of laboratory accidents. One that really stands out to me happened in 2015. And there in the US, almost 200 live anthrax samples were accidentally shipped out, not just across the country, but actually across the world. Now, these sorts of accidents are not rare. They happen more often than we'd all like to know. And this includes incidents all around the world where laboratory workers are accidentally infected with things like Ebola and Zika. So when we're thinking about biosecurity, when we're thinking about zoonotic disease, and when we're thinking about wild animals, we also need to consider what's happening in laboratories.
That's a great point, Vanessa. And one of the things that I draw from that is that regardless of what kind of human-animal, especially human-wildlife interaction we're dealing with, we're looking at a difference of degree in terms of zoonotic disease risk, not a difference of kind. So we have the same kind of risks from factory farms as we do from live markets, as we do from petting animals in petting wild animals in entertainment venues, as we do from biosecurity failures in labs. Fundamentally, we're talking about a scenario where animals and diseases resident in those animals are coming in contact with humans and vice versa. And those diseases have opportunities to jump host species. So the notion that this is somehow not here, not a problem that we are already dealing with, is utterly false. There may be a different flavor of problem depending on what facility you're talking about, but the fundamental issue is very much the same.
Yeah, there's certainly a surprising and shocking number of ways that we exploit animals that most people don't even think about that could give rise to disease transmission from animal to animal and animal to human. Thanks for detailing many of those for us. So whether privately kept as pets or held as attractions in roadside or traveling zoos, it's evident that most operations and individuals are ill-equipped to meet wild animals' complex needs, creating an environment ripe for zoonotic disease transmission. What can individuals do to help end this exploitation and reduce the likelihood of another public health crisis stemming from wild animal interactions?
I'm glad you asked this, Kim, because by focusing on wild animals, this underscores one of the issues that we should be thinking about alongside zoonotic disease in general, and that's novel zoonotic disease outbreak. We're exposed to zoonotic diseases on the regular. There are some zoonotic diseases that we as a human civilization have gotten very good at responding to. For example, humans around the globe are pretty good at responding to rabies outbreaks. We know where they come from, we know how to track them, we know how to respond. It's new diseases that we have a harder time with, and we get those new diseases, those new crossover points, particularly when we get crossover from species that we aren't continually exposed to. And this is something we often see with wildlife. So one of the factors here is that human-wildlife interactions poses a unique kind of risk in terms of zoonosis. Another is that this isn't just a one-way street. This isn't just a matter of humans being exposed to zoonotic disease and our health being implicated. It works the other way too, because zoonotic disease doesn't really care which host it's infecting. The disease just wants a good host. And so there are also zoonotics that travel from humans to animals or from domestic animals to wild animals that can have incredibly negative impacts. Many wild animal populations, for example, don't have any kind of immunity to domestically born diseases. And so you'll get, for example, distemper outbreaks passed by wild dogs decimating populations of wild ferrets or prairie dogs. You'll get scenarios where outdoor cats are passing parasites in their feces that wash downstream and perilously infect sea lions and seals in the ocean. These are not limited to humans, and it's not limited to animals in the immediate vicinity. It's a systemic problem, and it's one that we can address by being more aware of how we connect with other animals and how those animals connect with each other. So being aware of our individual contact with wild animals, the degree to which we promote inter-animal, interspecies contact, and how we can be safer about all of this.
David, I echo all of your points, and I want to emphasize the issue of diseases jumping from one group of animals to another. And I also want to emphasize the fact that each individual's actions have multiple consequences downstream. And I think a really useful way to look at this is through the lens of Newcastle disease. Newcastle disease is a contagious and fatal disease affecting all species of birds, and it's one of the most infectious diseases of domesticated fowl in the entire world. So we're at a virtual conference. I'm here in Southern California, and interestingly, Southern California is home to the two largest outbreaks of Newcastle disease in United States history. So that first one occurred 1971 to 1974, and it was traced to the importation and release of an infected exotic bird pet. Now, consequently, the Newcastle then jumped from that initial exotic pet bird to domestic commercial flocks. And what ended up happening is absolutely heartbreaking. Almost 12 million birds were killed to contain the outbreak. And this also had a taxpayer price tag of about $56 million in federal funds. The second Newcastle disease outbreak occurred in 2002 to 2003, and there cockfighting is attributed as the probable cause. But as in the prior example, Newcastle disease jumped from those animals held for fighting and went on to infect animals held for commercial food production. And there again, millions of animals were killed to contain this. And the taxpayer price tag was over $180 million in federal funds for this eradication. So this is no small issue. This is quite serious in terms of the number of animals that need to be killed for containment, as well as the price tag to contain these outbreaks.
Well, Vanessa and David, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge about farmed animals and wild animals as relates to zoonotic diseases. And thank you all for tuning in today as well.